The A229 through Bluebell Hill, Kent, November 19, 1965. A car carrying a bride-to-be and 3 friends crashed on this road. All died. Their names are preserved in burial registers at All Saints Church, Maidstone. Their deaths documented in coroner's reports, in newspaper accounts dated November 26, 1965, in the collective memory of a community that mourned them. 58 years later, drivers still see her. The young woman in white, standing at the roadside, vanishing when they stop to help. Whether this is memory made manifest, whether trauma imprints on location, whether the boundary between life and death is thinner at sites of violent tragedy. The line between documented history and unexplained phenomenon blurs on Britain's deadliest roads. Tonight we travel 6 roads where thousands died over centuries, where court records and burial registers preserve the names of the dead, where coaching accidents, highwaymen murders, winter exposure deaths, and modern crashes created patterns of tragedy that span from medieval times to yesterday, and where drivers, police officers, construction workers, credible witnesses with nothing to gain from lying, report experiencing things that documented history cannot fully explain. This is not ghost hunting. We will not provoke spirits or conduct seances. This is not skeptical debunking. We will not dismiss sincere experiences as mere psychology. This is documentary exploration of the documented tragedies that created Britain's darkest road legends, and the legends that persist despite, or perhaps because of, the documented history. Before the motorway system, before the railways, Britain's roads were the arteries of commerce and communication, and they were extraordinarily dangerous. The Old Bailey Court records, available online, document thousands of highway robberies and murders between 1674 and 1913. Parish burial registers record coaching accident victims by name, age, and cause of death. Newspaper archives from the 18th and 19th centuries are filled with accounts of crashes, freezings, and criminal violence on specific stretches of road. Coroner's reports detail exactly how people died, where they died, and often why they died. This evidence is not disputed. The deaths happened. The violence occurred. The roads ran red with documented bloodshed for centuries. But something else happened too, something the documents struggle to capture. Victorian travellers reported seeing phantom coaches on roads where crashes had occurred. Georgian coachmen refused to travel certain stretches after dark, speaking of figures that appeared and vanished. Modern drivers contact police insisting they struck pedestrians, only to find nothing when they stop. No body, no damage, just the lingering sensation that something was there. These reports are consistent. They cluster at specific locations. They describe similar phenomena across decades or centuries, and they come from people who have no obvious reason to fabricate. Police officers filing official incident reports, construction workers who quit jobs because of what they experienced, motorists who call emergency services believing they've committed vehicular manslaughter. Are these reports evidence of the supernatural? Are they psychological responses to knowledge about locations' dark histories? Are they something else entirely? Some mechanism by which violent death leaves marks on landscape that human consciousness can perceive but science cannot yet measure? The question remains open. What we can document is the history, the real, verified, preserved in archives history of how these 6 roads became synonymous with death. What we can report is the consistency of unexplained experiences at these specific locations. The gap between documented fact and reported experience, that gap is where tonight's journey takes place. We will examine the Great North Road, where 7 centuries of travellers died in conditions preserved in court testimony and burial records, and where phantom coaches are reported with such consistency that Victorian guidebooks warned travellers about them. Hounslow Heath, where over 100 documented highway robberies occurred in a single decade, where executed highwaymen were displayed in gibbets beside the road for years, and where figures in period costume are still seen. The A6 through Bedfordshire, where Dick Turpin's actual documented crimes were far less romantic than legend suggests, and where the line between historical criminal and ghostly apparition blurs in modern sightings. The A616 Stocksbridge bypass, where 1988 construction disturbed a medieval plague burial ground and workers began reporting experiences documented in police incident reports. Bluebell Hill, where the 1965 bride's death created Britain's most persistent ghost legend. And the M6, Britain's first motorway, where modern infrastructure intersects with ancient patterns of death in ways that traffic engineers cannot explain through accident statistics alone. Before we travel these roads, I must ask, have you subscribed to this channel? Because what we explore tonight requires understanding both historical documentation and the limits of that documentation. We need to examine primary sources, court records, burial registers, contemporary accounts. But we also need to acknowledge that some human experiences resist archival preservation, that credible people report phenomena that current scientific frameworks struggle to explain, that the relationship between violent death and haunting might be more complex than either pure skepticism or pure belief allows. Every death mentioned tonight is documented. Every source is cited. Every location is real and visitable today. But the experiences reported at these locations exist in territory where documentation becomes difficult. How do you archive a sighting? How do you preserve in official records the sensation of dread that overwhelms drivers at specific curves? How do you document the moment when a figure appears and vanishes? Victorian society called these experiences hauntings and interpreted them through spiritualist frameworks. Modern psychology calls them pareidolia, highway hypnosis, expectation-driven perception. Perhaps both frameworks capture partial truth. Perhaps neither captures the full complexity of what happens when human consciousness encounters sites where violent death occurred. I am Mr. Ravenhurst, and tonight we discover that Britain's deadliest roads earned their reputations first through documented tragedy, the names, dates, and circumstances preserved in archives, and second through experiences that resist documentation but refuse to cease being reported. The deaths are certain. What persists after death remains uncertain, and that uncertainty is where the journey begins. Our first road is the oldest, the longest, and perhaps the darkest. The Great North Road, the A1 7 centuries of documented death and 2 centuries of reported hauntings that began precisely when the deaths reached their peak. Chapter 1. The Great North Road, When Roads Remember. 409 miles from London to Edinburgh. Roman origins as Ermine Street. Medieval travellers knew it as the King's Highway, Georgian and Victorian Britain's primary coaching route, and according to documented records spanning 700 years, one of the deadliest stretches of road in British history. The deaths are not disputed. The Morning Chronicle, the Times, provincial newspapers, all documented coaching accidents with grim regularity. The British Newspaper Archive contains hundreds of reports. Let me provide specific examples where names, dates, and circumstances are preserved. January 15th, 1836. The Edinburgh to London mail coach overturned near Stamford, Lincolnshire. The driver, James Wilson, was thrown from his seat and killed instantly. The guard, Thomas Harper, was crushed beneath the coach. 2 outside passengers died from injuries. 3 inside passengers survived with broken bones. The coroner's report, preserved in Lincolnshire archives, provides details. Icy road, panicked horses, overturn at full speed. The verdict, accidental death. The victims are buried at St. Martin's Church, Stamford. You can visit their graves today. December 22nd, 1842. A winter storm struck the Great North Road in Northumberland. 3 coaches became stuck in drifts within 5 miles of Alnwick. 23 passengers attempted to walk to town. None reached it. Their bodies were found over the following week, some within a quarter mile of safety. The Newcastle Courant published all 23 names: merchants, travellers, a military officer, a governess, a family of 5. The parish burial registers at St Michael's Church in Alnwick record their burials. Death by exposure. December 1842. Real people, real deaths, documented. These were not isolated incidents. Between 1800 and 1850, the Stamford Mercury alone documented over 200 fatal coaching accidents on the Lincolnshire section of the Great North Road. The pattern was consistent. Steep hills caused brake failures. Winter storms created whiteout conditions. Flooding rendered sections impassable. Wheels shattered on frozen ruts. But coaching accidents were only one source of death. The Old Bailey Online contains over 400 cases of highway robbery on the Great North Road between 1700 and 1850. Of those 400 defendants, 237 were executed at Tyburn. Highway robbery was a capital offence, yet the robberies continued because the Great North Road offered perfect conditions. Valuable targets travelling predictable routes through remote countryside where help was distant. Dick Turpin operated on the Great North Road between 1735 and 1737. Court records confirm multiple robberies. One documented case from November 1735. Turpin and his gang stopped a mail coach near Epping Forest. They robbed passengers of approximately £12. When one passenger resisted, Turpin shot him in the leg. The passenger survived and later testified. This is not legend. This is Old Bailey testimony. Case reference available. Downloadable as PDF. Finchley Common, just north of London on the Great North Road, saw over 60 documented robberies between 1740 and 1750. The Gentleman's Magazine in 1751 called it more dangerous than any wilderness infested with wild beasts. Gibbets were erected along the road, displaying executed highwaymen's bodies in iron cages as deterrents. These gibbets remained for years until the bodies decomposed completely. Contemporary travellers describe passing rotting corpses hanging beside the road. This was not Gothic fiction. This was standard practice, documented in execution records and contemporary accounts. By the Victorian era, the Great North Road's reputation was firmly established. It was deadly. It was dangerous. Thousands had died on it over centuries. And then something else began to be reported. The first documented ghost story appears in Charles Dickens' journal, All the Year Round, in 1867. An article describing a phantom coach seen near Epping Forest, travelling at speed with 4 horses, a driver and a guard, then vanishing. The description matches coaching-era mail coaches exactly. The article treats this as curiosity, not endorsement, but it establishes the pattern. Real coaching tragedies beginning to transform into supernatural tales. Through the late Victorian period and into the 20th century, reports accumulated. Drivers seeing coaches that weren't there, hearing horses on roads where no horses ran, figures in period costume appearing and vanishing. These reports were not confined to superstitious locals. Police officers filed incident reports. Motoring organisations documented members' experiences. The Automobile Association in the 1930s received multiple reports of phantom coaches on the Great North Road, consistent enough that they investigated specific locations. The reports cluster at specific sites, the Epping Forest section where hundreds of documented robberies occurred, the Northumberland stretches where the 1842 storm killed 23, the Lincolnshire hills where coaching accidents were most frequent. This clustering is significant. Reports don't scatter randomly across the entire 400-mile road. They concentrate precisely where documented deaths were highest. Is this evidence of haunting? Is it historical knowledge influencing perception? People who know a location's dark history become hyper-alert, interpreting ordinary stimuli as confirming their expectations. Is it something else? Some mechanism by which violent death affects location in ways we can observe but not yet explain. Victorian society interpreted these experiences through spiritualist frameworks. They believed the dead could linger, that violent death created ghosts, that certain locations retained imprints of tragedy. This wasn't ignorance. Victorian intellectuals, scientists, even skeptics participated in spiritualist movements because they were attempting to understand reported phenomena using the best frameworks available to them. Modern psychology offers different frameworks. Highway hypnosis, the trance-like state induced by long-distance driving on featureless roads, can create brief perceptual disturbances. Pareidolia, the tendency to see patterns in random stimuli, can transform shadows into figures, especially when driving at night through locations you know are historically associated with death. Expectation influences perception. If you expect to see something, your brain may briefly generate the sensory experience even when external stimuli are absent. These explanations are rational, testable, consistent with what we know about human perception and cognition. They don't require supernatural belief. They explain most reported experiences through understood psychological mechanisms. But do they explain all experiences? Do they explain why reports cluster specifically at documented death sites rather than scattering randomly across the road? Do they explain the consistency of descriptions? Phantom coaches always matching period vehicles, figures always wearing period clothing? Do they explain incidents where multiple witnesses report the same phenomenon simultaneously, suggesting shared experience rather than individual hallucination? Perhaps psychology explains most cases, but not all. Perhaps some residue exists. Call it memory, call it imprint, call it whatever framework allows you to hold the tension between documented fact and reported experience. Perhaps roads do remember. Not consciously, not intentionally, but through some mechanism where human consciousness encounters echoes of violent death and processes those encounters as visual, auditory, or emotional phenomena. Or perhaps the skeptics are entirely correct. Perhaps every report has rational explanation. Perhaps human psychology combined with historical knowledge creates all phantom coaches, all period figures, all sensations of dread at specific locations. Perhaps nothing supernatural exists, only complex interactions between memory, expectation, and perception. The evidence permits both interpretations. The deaths are documented beyond dispute. The reports of unexplained phenomena are documented beyond dispute. The gap between, that's where belief and skepticism meet, where evidence reaches its limits, where individual experience becomes the final arbiter. What we know with certainty: 700 years of travelers died on the Great North Road. Their deaths are preserved in archives. Their names can be read in burial registers. Their suffering was real. Whether anything of them persists, whether their deaths left marks that can be perceived, whether the Great North Road remembers its victims, that remains uncertain. We travel now from Britain's longest deadly road to its most concentrated, Hounslow Heath, 7 miles west of London, where 4,000 acres of open common land became the site of over 100 documented highway robberies in a single decade, where executed highwaymen were displayed in gibbets for years, and where figures in 18th century costume are reported with unsettling consistency. Chapter 2: Hounslow Heath, where the dead were displayed. 4,000 acres between Hounslow and Staines. The Great West Road, today's A4, crossed it for its entire length. In the 18th century, this was arguably the most dangerous 7 miles of road in Britain. The Old Bailey tried dozens of cases involving Hounslow Heath robberies. Execution records list the names of convicted highwaymen hanged specifically for crimes committed here. And their bodies were brought back to Hounslow Heath, encased in iron cages called gibbets, and displayed beside the road where they had committed their crimes. The deaths, both of victims and of executed criminals, are thoroughly documented. Let me provide specific cases from Old Bailey records. William Page, tried September 1707. On August 15, 1707, Page stopped a coach on Hounslow Heath at approximately 8 p.m. 6 passengers aboard. Page was armed with pistols. He demanded money. Total take, £8, 3 shillings. One passenger, Thomas Green, resisted. Page shot him in the shoulder. Green survived and testified at trial. Page was convicted and executed at Tyburn on September 24, 1707. His body was brought back to Hounslow Heath and gibbeted at the robbery site. James Carrick and John Smith, tried January 1729. On December 20th, 1728, they stopped the Bath to London mail coach on Hounslow Heath. They stole the mail bags, found £20 in banknotes. The post office offered a £40 reward, double the stolen amount. They were captured, tried, convicted, executed within 6 weeks. Both bodies were gibbeted on Hounslow Heath. Edward Burnworth, tried April 1726. Burnworth specialised in Hounslow Heath robberies. Court records document at least 7 separate crimes between 1724 and 1726. On his final robbery, he recognised one of his victims, which led to his identification and arrest. He was executed in April 1726. His body was gibbeted on Hounslow Heath, remaining on display for over 10 years. These gibbets were deliberate. Executed highwaymen's bodies were encased in iron cages shaped to the human form, suspended from wooden posts 20 feet high, positioned beside the road where crimes had occurred. The bodies decomposed slowly, months or years depending on weather. Birds picked at the remains. Travellers passing on the road could see rotting corpses, smell them, were forced to confront the reality of capital punishment and the fate of criminals. Contemporary accounts describe the horror of travelling past gibbets. Daniel Defoe, writing in 1724, described Hounslow Heath as a terror to travellers, not only because of robbery danger, but because of the dreadful spectacle of gibbeted bodies. The Gentleman's Magazine published multiple articles about Hounslow Heath gibbets, describing them as both deterrent and source of public unease. The gibbets remained until the bodies fell apart completely. Then the iron cages remained, empty, swaying in wind, creating sounds that travellers found deeply unsettling. Some gibbet posts remained in place until the early 19th century, long after the practice of gibbeting ended in 1834. By the Victorian era, Hounslow Heath had been enclosed, divided into private properties, cultivated, built upon. The open wasteland that enabled robberies no longer existed. The gibbets were gone, the bodies long decomposed. But the reputation persisted, and the reports began. The earliest documented ghost story appears in the Times in 1872, a letter describing a phantom highwayman seen near the former gibbet site. The description is specific: a figure on horseback, wearing 18th century clothing, visible for a moment before vanishing. Not a medieval ghost, not a vague apparition, a figure from the highwaymen era, from the period when Hounslow Heath was most dangerous. Through the late Victorian period and into the 20th century, reports accumulated. Multiple witnesses describing figures on horseback, figures in period costumes standing beside the road, the sound of horses' hooves on roads where no horses travelled. These reports clustered around specific locations that historical maps confirm were gibbet sites. The junction near where William Page's body was displayed. The stretch where Edward Burnworth's gibbet stood for a decade. In 1923, a motorist contacted police reporting seeing a figure in 18th century clothing standing beside the A4 near Hounslow. Police investigated, found no one. The motorist was adamant. He had seen someone, period clothing, standing motionless, then vanishing when he looked back. This wasn't folklore. This was a police incident report, an official document. In 1967, multiple drivers reported similar experiences over a 2-week period. Figures beside the road, period clothing, vanishing when approached. The reports were consistent enough that local newspapers investigated, interviewing witnesses independently. The descriptions matched, the locations matched. All corresponded to documented gibbet sites. Modern reports continue. As recently as 2015, witnesses reported seeing figures in period costume near the Hounslow section of the A4. Each time, police investigate. Each time, they find nothing. The pattern persists. Report, investigation, no physical evidence. Witness remains convinced they saw something. Are these hauntings? Are these the executed highwaymen, their bodies displayed for years beside the road, somehow remaining connected to those locations? Are these the victims of robberies, travelers who died violently, whose deaths were never fully commemorated or mourned? Or are these psychological responses to historical knowledge? Hounslow Heath's history is well known locally. People who drive the A4 know they're travelling what was once Britain's most dangerous road. They know about the gibbets, the displayed bodies, the decades of systematic violence. This knowledge creates expectation. Expectation influences perception. A shadow becomes a figure. A moment of pareidolia becomes a sighting. But the clustering troubles the purely psychological explanation. If these were simply expectations creating false perceptions, why would they cluster at specific locations that modern witnesses have no obvious way of knowing were gibbet sites? Historical maps showing gibbet locations are not common knowledge. Most modern drivers don't know where specific gibbets stood. Yet sightings cluster precisely at those locations. Perhaps local folklore preserves that knowledge unconsciously. Perhaps stories circulate about specific stretches being unlucky or strange. And those stories derive ultimately from gibbet locations, creating self-fulfilling expectations. Perhaps, or perhaps something else occurs. Perhaps decades of decomposing bodies, displayed deliberately as terror, left marks. Not supernatural marks necessarily, but marks. Call them psychological, call them environmental, call them whatever framework allows you to hold the possibility that prolonged exposure to death affects location in ways we observe but don't yet understand. Victorian spiritualists would have said the gibbeted bodies created ghosts, that souls of executed criminals lingered at execution sites. Modern psychology says expectation creates perception. Perhaps both capture partial truth. Perhaps the executed criminals don't haunt consciously, but their prolonged presence, bodies slowly decomposing over years, affected the locations in ways that human consciousness occasionally perceives. The gibbet posts are gone. The bodies decomposed centuries ago. Hounslow Heath is now residential and commercial development. The A4 passes through continuous urban landscape. No trace remains of the open wasteland where robberies occurred. Yet the reports continue. Figures in period costume. Horses' hooves on modern asphalt. Feelings of dread at specific locations. Whether these are genuine hauntings, whether they're psychological responses to historical knowledge, whether they're something else entirely, the deaths that created them were real. Over 100 documented robberies, dozens of executions, bodies displayed for years. This happened. What remains of that happening is where certainty ends and experience begins. We move now from the western approach to London to the road north, to the A6 through Bedfordshire, where Dick Turpin's actual documented crimes occurred, and where the most famous highwayman in British history has become so entangled with legend that separating historical fact from phantom sighting requires careful examination of court records and contemporary testimony. Chapter 3: The A6, where legend becomes ghost, Dick Turpin. The name itself has become inseparable from romantic legend. The gentleman highwayman, the famous ride to York, the charming criminal who robbed the rich. Almost everything in that popular image is Victorian fiction, invented by novelists and perpetuated by films. The real Dick Turpin was a violent criminal whose documented crimes were concentrated on the A6 through Bedfordshire, not the Great North Road as legend claims. He participated in home invasions that involved torture. He shot people during robberies. He was executed for horse theft, not for romantic highway robbery. But something strange has happened. The fictional Turpin has become so powerful, so embedded in cultural consciousness, that people report seeing him, not seeing a highwayman who might have been Turpin, seeing a figure they identify as Turpin specifically, despite the fact that no contemporary portraits exist, and no one knows what Turpin actually looked like. This is where legend and haunting intersect in fascinating ways. Is it possible to be haunted by fiction? Can cultural belief create perceptual phenomena? Does the line between historical person and legendary figure blur in ways that generate reported experiences? Let me establish the documented facts first. Richard Turpin was born in Hempstead, Essex, in 1705. Baptism records confirm this. He was apprenticed to a butcher, married in 1728. Established himself as a butcher in Thaxted, Essex. He entered crime gradually, first poaching, then livestock theft, then joining the Gregory Gang in 1735. The Gregory Gang's activities are thoroughly documented in court records and newspaper accounts. They weren't romantic highwaymen, they were home invaders. The Gentleman's Magazine, February 1735, documented one attack. The gang broke into a farmhouse near Loughton, Essex, tortured the elderly farmer by holding him over his own fire, raped his servant, and stole approximately £40. Most of the Gregory Gang was captured and executed in 1735. Turpin escaped and shifted to highway robbery, operating primarily on roads through Epping Forest and Bedfordshire, the routes connecting London to Bedford, which today form parts of the A6 corridor. The Old Bailey records document several Turpin robberies. Case from May 1737. Turpin stopped a coach near Welwyn, Hertfordshire, on the Bedford Road. He robbed passengers of approximately £8. He shot one passenger who resisted. The passenger survived and later testified. This case didn't go to trial immediately because Turpin fled, but the testimony was preserved. The famous ride to York never happened. This story was invented by William Harrison Ainsworth in his 1834 novel, Rookwood. Ainsworth created a fictional Turpin who made a dramatic overnight ride from London to York on a mare named Black Bess. The novel was immensely popular. It created the romantic Turpin legend, but it was fiction. No contemporary source mentions any such ride. The real Turpin fled to Yorkshire and lived quietly under the assumed name John Palmer. He was arrested in 1738 for horse theft, a capital offence. Initially tried as John Palmer, his real identity was discovered during the trial. He was convicted of horse theft and executed at York on April 7th, 1739. Contemporary accounts describe the execution as unremarkable, except that Turpin joked with the executioner and jumped from the ladder himself. Approximately 1,000 people attended. He was buried at St. George's Church, York. His grave can still be visited. This is the documented historical Turpin, a violent criminal who terrorized Essex and Bedfordshire for approximately 4 years, who participated in brutal home invasions, who shot people during robberies, who was executed for horse theft. Not romantic, not a hero, a documented criminal whose actual crimes are preserved in court records. Yet the sightings report Dick Turpin, specifically by name. Drivers on the A6 through Bedfordshire report seeing a highwayman they identify as Turpin. Figures on horseback in 18th century costume, sometimes described as wearing a tricorn hat. The classic highwayman image popularized by illustrations in Ainsworth's novel. The figure appears, sometimes seems to gesture, then vanishes. These reports have been documented since the Victorian era. Local newspapers in Bedfordshire published accounts through the late 1800s. The reports continued into the 20th century. In 1952, a motorist reported seeing a figure on horseback beside the A6 near Bedford. When he slowed, the figure vanished. He described it as looking like Dick Turpin from the pictures, not a highwayman, specifically Turpin. In 1979, multiple witnesses reported similar experiences over several months. A figure on horseback, period costume, appearing near specific junctions on the A6 through Bedfordshire. Each time, witnesses identified the figure as Turpin. Despite not knowing what the historical Turpin looked like, and despite the fact that the figure matched Ainsworth's fictional description more than historical reality. This creates a fascinating problem. If these are genuine hauntings, whose ghost is it? The real Turpin died in York, not Bedfordshire. He was buried in York. If ghosts are connected to burial sites or death locations, Turpin's ghost should haunt York, not the A6. Unless ghosts are connected not to death locations, but to crime locations, the places where the person committed acts of violence during life. But the reported figure matches fictional Turpin more than historical Turpin. The tricorn hat, the dramatic pose, the gentleman highwayman appearance. These are Victorian inventions from Ainsworth's novel and subsequent illustrations. They're not how the real Turpin dressed or behaved. Historical accounts describe Turpin as brutal, not charming. Contemporary descriptions of his appearance don't survive. So if the sightings match the fictional Turpin, are people seeing what they expect to see based on cultural knowledge? Are expectations so powerful that they generate visual experiences matching fictional rather than historical sources? Or is something stranger happening? Can cultural belief become so strong that it creates something? Not the historical person's ghost, but a thought form, an entity generated by collective expectation and belief. This sounds like pseudoscience, but it engages seriously with the question: if hundreds of people over centuries expect to see Dick Turpin on the A6, and many report seeing exactly what they expect, what mechanism explains this? The skeptical answer is clear. Expectation creates false perception. People who know Turpin legend, who drive roads where Turpin actually operated, prime themselves to interpret ambiguous stimuli as confirming expectations. A trick of light becomes a figure. A shadow becomes a horseback rider. The brain fills in details matching cultural memory, tricorn hat, dramatic pose, because that's what Dick Turpin looks like in collective imagination. This explanation is rational, testable, consistent with what we know about human perception. It explains the reports without requiring supernatural belief. But it doesn't fully explain why reports cluster on the A6 specifically, where Turpin actually committed documented crimes, rather than on the Great North Road where legend falsely places him. People who believe the legend should report sightings on the wrong road, yet they don't. Sightings cluster where historical crimes occurred, not where legend places them. This suggests something about the actual locations matters, not just cultural knowledge. Perhaps both factors operate simultaneously. Perhaps Turpin's actual crimes, violent robberies, shootings, terrorizing travelers, left some mark on the A6 locations where they occurred. Perhaps that mark isn't the man himself, but the fear he generated, the violence he committed, the trauma he caused. And perhaps later cultural knowledge, the romantic legend, the fictional image, shapes how people perceive and interpret whatever residue remains. The A6 has other documented tragedies beyond Turpin. In 1748, Thomas Cook murdered a mail guard near Bedford. Cook was executed and gibbeted at the murder site. His body remained on display for over a decade. In 1961, the A6 murder, Michael Gregston shot dead, Valerie Story paralyzed, created a modern tragedy that remains controversial. The road has accumulated death across centuries. Modern A6 ghost reports include not just Turpin, but other figures. Phantom hitchhikers, figures in 1960s clothing near where the 1961 murder occurred. Reports of unease, of dread, of sensing something wrong at specific junctions. These reports don't involve Turpin legend. They suggest something about the road itself, about locations where violent death occurred, creates conditions where unexplained experiences cluster. Whether these are hauntings, whether they're psychological responses to historical knowledge, whether they're something else, the deaths were real. Turpin's victims were real people who were robbed, shot, terrorized. Thomas Cook's victim was real. Michael Gregston and Valerie Story were real. Their suffering is documented. Whether anything of that suffering persists, whether trauma imprints on location, whether consciousness encounters echoes of violence, that remains uncertain. The A6 remembers. Whether through human psychology or through something else, whether as legend or as haunting, the road remembers its violent past, and travelers continue to report experiencing something, seeing figures, feeling dread, sensing presence, at locations where documented violence occurred. We move now from roads with long violent histories to a modern road built over historical tragedy. The A616 Stocksbridge Bypass, where 1988 construction disturbed a medieval plague burial ground, and construction workers began experiencing phenomena documented in police reports serious enough that work was briefly suspended. Chapter 4, a 616 Stocksbridge Bypass, Disturbing the Dead, September 1987. Construction began on the A616 Stocksbridge Bypass in South Yorkshire. Modern road engineering, standard construction practices, expected completion in 18 months. Then workers began finding bones. The bones were human, medieval. Archaeological assessment dated them to approximately 1348 to 1350. The Black Death. Between 30 and 60% of England's population died during the Black Death over 1348 to 1350. Normal burial practices became impossible. Mass graves, plague pits, were dug outside church grounds. Bodies were buried rapidly, layered in trenches covered with quicklime. The Stocksbridge burial ground was such a mass grave, forgotten for over 600 years. Construction law required respectful treatment of human remains. The bones were excavated carefully, recorded, eventually reburied in consecrated ground. This process took weeks. Construction workers continued working around the archaeological excavation, and then the reports began. October 1987. 2 security guards working night shift reported seeing a figure near the excavation, dark robe or cloak, standing motionless. When they approached, it vanished. They reported this to their supervisor, who dismissed it as misperception or prank. But reports continued. Multiple workers, interviewed separately, described seeing a robed figure near the burial site. the descriptions were consistent. Dark robes, hood-covering face, standing or walking slowly, disappearing when approached. Some described the figure as monk-like, though no specific order could be identified. The reports were frequent enough that site managers contacted police. South Yorkshire Police took them seriously, not because they believed in ghosts, but because they suspected trespassers creating safety hazards. Police conducted night patrols in September and October 1987. The documented police incident that attracted media attention occurred on September 8, 1987. 2 police officers in a patrol car were monitoring the site at approximately 11 p.m. They reported seeing a figure near the excavation, dark clothing. Standing beside the excavation, not moving. The officers exited their vehicle and approached. As they got closer, the figure vanished. They searched thoroughly, found no one. The officers filed an official incident report. The report describes what they saw, notes they found no trespasser, recommends continued monitoring. Importantly, the report doesn't claim they saw a ghost. It simply documents an unexplained observation. This is preserved in South Yorkshire Police archives. This is not folklore. This is an official police document. More reports followed through late 1987. Workers began refusing night shifts. Some quit entirely. Site managers consulted with the archaeological team and local historians, trying to understand why these reports were occurring. One theory emerged. The robed figure descriptions matched plague doctors or monks who would have attended plague burials in the 14th century. Plague doctors wore distinctive long robes and beaked masks. Monks wore dark hooded robes. If workers knew they were excavating plague burials, their expectations might have influenced perceptions. This is significant. Reports began after workers knew about the plague burials. Before the bones were discovered, no one reported anything unusual. After the discovery, and after workers learned what they were excavating, reports proliferated. This pattern suggests psychological influence, but it doesn't explain the police report. The officers didn't know they were investigating a plague burial site when they filed their incident report. They were investigating suspected trespassers. They saw something, approached it, it vanished. They documented this professionally, without supernatural interpretation. Modern psychology understands hypervigilance and expectation-driven perception. When people work in disturbing conditions, handling human remains, excavating mass graves, they become anxious, alert, primed to notice anything unusual. This anxiety can create perceptual errors. Shadows become figures. Reflections become faces. This is normal human psychology, not supernatural activity. But archaeology and anthropology also recognize that handling human remains affects people psychologically in ways that transcend simple anxiety. There's something visceral about touching bones, about working on top of mass graves, about disturbing the dead. Workers reported nightmares, unease, reluctance to touch remains even with protective equipment. This is universal human response to death and dead bodies. The construction was completed in 1988. The bypass opened in May 1988. The robed figure reports ceased almost immediately once construction ended and workers left. If the phenomenon were genuinely supernatural, why would it stop when construction ended? The most rational explanation: reports were psychological responses to disturbing work, and once that work ended, the psychological trigger ended. But the story didn't end. By the 1990s, the A616 Stocksbridge bypass had gained a reputation as haunted. Local newspapers repeated construction-era stories. Ghost hunting groups visited, and new reports emerged. Drivers seeing figures beside the road. Vehicles experiencing unexplained mechanical failures. Feelings of unease. These new reports follow a pattern seen at other haunted locations. Once a place is labelled haunted, reports proliferate because people expect to experience something unusual. Expectation primes perception. Any odd occurrence, a deer glimpsed in headlights, engine trouble, ordinary anxiety of driving a dark road, becomes interpreted as paranormal. Yet beneath all reports, whether from 1987 construction workers or modern drivers, is genuine historical tragedy. The Black Death killed between 75 and 200 million people across Eurasia. England lost perhaps half its population. The Stocksbridge plague pit represents dozens or hundreds of individuals who died during one of history's worst pandemics, who were buried rapidly and impersonally, whose names are lost. They weren't ghosts. They were people. They suffered. They died. Their bodies were placed in a mass grave that was forgotten for 6 centuries. When modern construction disturbed that grave, workers had to confront the reality of death on a scale that's difficult to process. Did this disturbance create hauntings? Did disturbing 600-year-old remains somehow release spirits that had been dormant? Does desecration of burial sites create paranormal activity? Or did disturbing remains create psychological disturbance in living people? Workers who had to handle bones, who had to work on top of a mass grave, who experienced normal human anxiety about death and dead bodies. Did that anxiety manifest as perceptual disturbances that were misinterpreted as supernatural? The evidence supports both interpretations, which is perhaps the most honest answer. The plague victims were real. Their suffering was real. Their burial in a mass grave was real. The disturbance of their remains was real. And the workers' experiences, whether psychological, whether supernatural, whether something else, were real in the sense that people genuinely experienced something that disturbed them enough to report it to police and to quit their jobs. Whether we call this haunting or psychology or collective anxiety or something else, the human response to disturbed plague burials reveals something important. We are not as separated from historical death as we think. 600 years hadn't erased the emotional impact of mass death. When workers encountered physical evidence of plague victims, they responded with anxiety, nightmares, perceptual disturbances. The dead, whether as literal ghosts or as psychological presence, had power. The A616 bypass crosses that burial site. The bones have been reburied in consecrated ground. Traffic flows normally, yet the stories persist because the disturbance was real, because workers' experiences were real, because the plague victims' deaths were real. What remains of all that reality is where we must hold uncertainty. We move now from a modern road built over medieval death to a road where geography itself creates deadly conditions that persist across centuries, where the same dangerous curve killed coaching passengers in 1800 and killed a bride-to-be in 1965. Bluebell Hill in Kent, where documented tragedy and reported haunting intersect at a location you can visit today. Chapter 5. Bluebell Hill, where geometry kills. The A229 through Bluebell Hill, Kent. A steep descent from the North Downs, dropping approximately 400 feet over 2 miles. Near the bottom, a sharp left curve. This geometry, steep descent plus sharp curve, has killed travellers for over 2 centuries. November 19th, 1965. A Ford Cortina carrying 4 young women descended Bluebell Hill at approximately 9 p.m. The weather was clear. The road was dry. The driver was sober. But the car left the road on the outside of the curve and crashed into trees. Suzanne Brown died instantly. Patricia Ferguson died instantly. Judith Lingham died at the scene. The driver survived with serious injuries. The crash was investigated by Kent police. The coroner's inquest, held in December 1965, determined accidental death. The coroner noted that the road geometry was dangerous and recommended improvements. The victims were buried: Suzanne Brown at All Saints Church, Maidstone; Patricia Ferguson and Judith Lingham at St. Margaret's Church, Rochester. Their deaths are documented in burial registers. The Kent Messenger, November 26, 1965, published their names and photographs. Families mourned them. The community remembered them. Within months, drivers began reporting seeing a young woman in white standing at the roadside near the crash location. When drivers stopped to help, she would vanish. The descriptions were consistent: white dress, appearing distressed, disappearing when approached. These reports have continued for 58 years. Multiple drivers have contacted police believing they hit a pedestrian, only to find nothing when they stopped. Some report seeing the figure walk into the road, feeling an impact, then finding no body and no damage. The white dress is significant. Suzanne Brown was traveling to her wedding rehearsal. She was to be married the next day. Local legend emphasizes this tragic detail: a bride-to-be killed the night before her wedding. The white dress signals bride, creating emotional resonance. But we don't know what Suzanne was actually wearing when she died. The white dress appears in legend, not in documented facts. Yet the reports continue. And they cluster at this specific curve where documented deaths occurred. Before the 1965 crash, this same location killed coaching-era travelers. The Kent Archaeological Society archives contain references to Bluebell Hill coaching accidents. The steep descent that challenged modern braking systems also challenged coaching brakes in the 1800s. St. Margaret's Church, Rochester Burial Register, contains entries for coaching accident victims from Bluebell Hill. John Smith, aged 42, coachman, killed when his coach overturned on Bluebell Hill, buried 14th of March, 1823. The register contains at least a dozen similar entries between 1800 and 1850. The geography explains why. The same steep descent, the same sharp curve, the same deadly combination that killed in 1823 killed in 1965 and continues to cause accidents today despite modern improvements. Bluebell Hill has seen over 50 fatal accidents since 1965. The road has been widened, guardrails installed, warning signs added, speed cameras deployed, yet crashes continue. This persistence is documented. Kent Police accident reports show Bluebell Hill has a higher than average fatal accident rate for similar roads. The curve itself creates danger through physics. Momentum on the steep descent carries vehicles toward the outside of the curve, where guardrails now prevent cars from leaving the road entirely, but crashes still occur. So when modern drivers report seeing figures, feeling unease, experiencing inexplicable anxiety on this specific curve, are they responding to genuine paranormal phenomena? Or are they responding to subtle environmental cues, the dangerous geometry, the slight banking that feels wrong, the visual disorientation of the steep descent, that create anxiety, which then manifests as perceptual disturbances? Traffic psychology research documents that drivers become anxious at dangerous locations, even when they don't consciously recognize why the location is dangerous. The body responds to environmental danger cues, steep grades, sharp curves, poor sightlines, before conscious thought processes them. This anxiety can manifest as hypervigilance, which makes drivers more likely to notice and misinterpret ambiguous stimuli. A white plastic bag caught on a branch can look like a figure in white. Fog-reflecting headlights can create shapes that appear and disappear. The psychological state of heightened anxiety primes perception to find patterns, see faces, detect threats. This is survival beneficial brain function, not supernatural sensitivity. But does this explain all reports? Does it explain why multiple witnesses sometimes report seeing the same figure simultaneously? Does it explain reports from people who didn't know about the crash history, who weren't primed by cultural knowledge, who simply drove the curve and saw something they couldn't explain. In 1992, a German tourist driving through Kent stopped at Bluebell Hill police station to report he'd seen a young woman who appeared to be in distress. He didn't speak English well, didn't know local legends, had no obvious reason to fabricate. He simply saw someone who looked like they needed help, stopped, found no one. Police searched, found nothing. This report exists in Kent police logs. The tourist had no apparent knowledge of Bluebell Hill ghost stories. Such reports complicate pure psychological explanations. If you don't know a location's history, if cultural expectations aren't priming your perception, why would you see exactly what hundreds of others have reported seeing? Coincidence? Shared misperception of the same environmental stimuli? Or something else? Perhaps trauma does imprint on location, not in a supernatural sense necessarily, but in some way where violent death affects environment, and human consciousness, especially consciousness already anxious from navigating dangerous road geometry, occasionally perceives those effects. Perhaps Suzanne Brown's death, coming at a location where dozens had already died, added to some cumulative weight that manifests under specific conditions. This sounds like pseudoscience, which means we should be cautious about it. But it attempts to take seriously both the documented deaths and the documented reports of unexplained experiences without dismissing either as irrelevant. Victorian society would have said Suzanne's death created a ghost, that her spirit lingered at the death site. Modern psychology says anxiety plus expectation creates false perception. Perhaps both frameworks capture partial truth. Perhaps Suzanne doesn't haunt consciously, but her death, violent, sudden, tragic, mourned by a community, left something. Call it memory, call it imprint, call it whatever allows you to hold tension between skepticism and reported experience. Modern Bluebell Hill has been significantly improved. The road is wider. Guardrails prevent cars from leaving the road. Warning signs alert drivers to danger. Speed cameras enforce limits. Accident rates have decreased, but crashes still occur, and ghost sightings still occur. Whether these sightings are genuine hauntings, whether they're psychological responses to dangerous geometry, whether they're expectation-driven misperceptions, whether there's something else. Suzanne Brown's death was real. Her tragedy imprinted on the community. 58 years later, her name is still spoken. The ghost story, however we interpret it, keeps her memory alive. Perhaps that's the point. Perhaps ghost stories serve memorial functions, ensuring the dead are remembered when official commemoration fades. Suzanne Brown's grave can be visited, but how many people visit it? The ghost story, however, ensures thousands of drivers think about her death, remember the tragedy, exercise caution on a dangerous curve. Whether supernatural or psychological or something else, the Bluebell Hill ghost preserves memory of real death, warns of real danger, honors a real person whose life was cut short by road geometry that continues to threaten travelers today. We move now to our final road, Britain's first motorway, where modern infrastructure was supposed to eliminate death through engineering excellence, but instead created new patterns of tragedy that echo coaching-era deaths in unexpected ways. The M6, where phantom hitchhikers and unexplained anxiety reveal that even modern roads cannot escape the weight of accumulated death. Chapter 6. The M6, Modern Roads, Ancient Patterns, December 5th, 1958. The Preston Bypass opened in Lancashire, an 8-mile stretch of dual carriageway that became Britain's first motorway. Modern road engineering had arrived. Grade-separated junctions, controlled access, no traffic lights, designed for continuous high-speed travel. The motorway system promised safety through engineering excellence. Initially, it delivered. The Preston bypass's accident rate was significantly lower than the comparable roads. As the M6 extended, reaching from Rugby to Carlisle by 1970, it became one of Britain's primary transport arteries, carrying millions of vehicles annually. But patterns emerged. Certain junctions had disproportionately high accident rates. Certain stretches developed reputations as unlucky. And predictably, given Britain's tradition of attributing danger to the supernatural, certain M6 sections acquired ghost stories. The M6 has no obvious historical reason to be haunted. It wasn't built over medieval trackways or coaching routes. It's a 20th century creation, engineered using modern principles, built through previously undeveloped countryside or industrial areas. Yet the ghost stories exist, and examining them reveals something about how modern infrastructure intersects with ancient patterns of death. The most frequently reported phenomenon is the phantom hitchhiker near Junction 16, Sambach, Cheshire. Reports began appearing in local newspapers in the early 1970s. The pattern is consistent. A driver sees a figure at the roadside, appearing to hitchhike. Feeling sympathetic or concerned, the driver slows or stops. When they look back, no one is there. These reports are documented. The Crew Chronicle published multiple accounts between 1972 and 1990. Police received occasional calls from drivers requesting assistance for a hitchhiker they'd seen. Each time, searchers found no one. Junction 16 has had a higher than average fatal accident rate since the M6 opened. Cheshire Police accident reports document multiple fatal crashes at or near Junction 16. Some involved pedestrians, people whose vehicles broke down, who were struck while walking on the motorway. Others involved vehicles leaving the motorway and crashing. The correlation between actual hitchhiker deaths and phantom hitchhiker reports is documented. Between 1960 and 1980, hitchhiking was common despite the danger. The M6 saw multiple hitchhiker deaths. Junction 16, being a major interchange, was a location where hitchhikers tried to catch rides. Some died there. One documented case. In 1974, a 19-year-old man was hitchhiking near Junction 16. He was struck by a vehicle and killed. Hit and run. The incident was reported in the Crew Chronicle, February 1974. The driver was never identified. The victim's death is documented in the coroner's report. This real death, and others like it, created conditions for legend. When drivers glimpse someone at the roadside, an actual hitchhiker, or perhaps a motorist with a broken-down vehicle, they might experience anxiety, wondering if the person is real or ghostly. If they stop and find no one, this confirms the ghost story. But there's also highway hypnosis, the trance-like state induced by long-distance motorway driving. The constant speed, the rhythmic white lines, the lack of visual variation create conditions where drivers remain functional, but attention wanders. During highway hypnosis, brief perceptual disturbances are common. A shadow becomes a figure, a road sign becomes a person. Then attention refocuses and the figure is gone. This is well documented in traffic psychology research. Highway hypnosis is more likely on long, straight, featureless roads, exactly the conditions of motorway travel. It's not dangerous itself because drivers respond to emergencies even in this state. But it creates brief moments where perception is unreliable. So the M6 phantom hitchhiker might combine real hitchhiker deaths, driver anxiety about those deaths, highway hypnosis creating brief misperceptions, and the human tendency to interpret ambiguous experiences through cultural frameworks, the ghost story. But Junction 16 isn't the only M6 location with supernatural reports. Junction 3, near Nuneaton, acquired a reputation after a tragic crash in 1989. A coach carrying elderly passengers crashed at Junction 3, killing 12 people. The crash was caused by driver error combined with ice on the motorway, despite it being April. The crash was investigated, improvements were made, compensation was paid. But the deaths created anxiety. Within a year, drivers began reporting seeing a coach near Junction 3, visible for a moment before vanishing. These reports were less frequent than Junction 16 hitchhiker sightings, but consistent enough that they entered local folklore. The ghost coach reports follow a pattern. Drivers see what appears to be a coach ahead, traveling slowly. They prepare to overtake. As they get closer, the coach isn't there. They've passed nothing. This might be visual memory combined with expectation. Drivers familiar with the 1989 crash might think about it when passing Junction 3. This thought creates a momentary visual memory, like seeing something that isn't there because you're thinking about it intensely. This isn't supernatural, but is a known perceptual phenomenon where thoughts create brief sensory experiences. The M6 also generates reports of unease, of dread, of sensing something wrong at specific locations. These reports are harder to document because they're subjective, but they're consistent enough that they appear in motorway forums, in driver discussions, in local knowledge. Perhaps these feelings of unease are rational responses to genuine danger. The M6 passes through remote areas. If your vehicle breaks down on a remote section at night, help might be distant. You're alone in darkness, beside traffic passing at lethal speeds. This is genuinely frightening. And this anxiety might create perceptual errors. Tired drivers, anxious drivers, driving at night, might misinterpret ordinary stimuli as threatening. A reflection becomes a following vehicle. A sound becomes mechanical failure. The ordinary fatigue of long-distance driving becomes something more sinister. These experiences aren't paranormal, but are predictable results of combining human psychology with motorway travel conditions. Yet the fact that they cluster at specific locations, Junction 16, Junction 3, other sites with documented high accident rates, suggests something about those locations matters. Perhaps locations where deaths cluster develop reputations. Local knowledge circulates, Junction 16 is unlucky. This knowledge creates expectation. Expectation influences perception. Drivers approaching Junction 16 become hyper-alert, noticing anything unusual, interpreting ambiguities as confirming the location's dangerous reputation. Or perhaps something else occurs. Perhaps locations where deaths cluster acquire some quality, call it environmental, call it psychological, call it whatever framework you prefer, that human consciousness perceives as wrong, as dangerous, as haunted. Perhaps accumulated death affects location in ways we observe but don't yet understand. The M6 is statistically one of Britain's safer major roads. Modern engineering, lighting, maintenance, and traffic management have reduced death rates dramatically compared to historical roads. But death hasn't been eliminated. Fatal crashes still occur, and where they cluster, ghost stories emerge. The ghosts, whether real or psychological or something else, serve functions. They mark dangerous locations. They warn drivers to exercise caution. They memorialize the dead, ensuring accidents aren't forgotten or reduced to statistics. They provide narrative framework for processing fear about motorway travel. Perhaps we should stop asking whether ghosts are real and start asking what purposes ghost stories serve. The M6 Phantom Hitchhiker warns that hitchhiking is dangerous, that stopping on motorways is dangerous, that Junction 16 requires attention. Whether the hitchhiker is supernatural or psychological, the warning is valid. Deaths occurred. More deaths could occur. The ghost story communicates danger in ways that statistics cannot. Britain's first motorway was supposed to herald a new era of safe travel. Engineering excellence would eliminate death. But the M6 reveals that no road, however modern, escapes the weight of death. Where people die, others remember. Where deaths cluster, stories emerge. Whether we call these stories ghosts or folklore or warnings, they perform similar functions. They remember the dead. They warn the living. They acknowledge that travel, however improved, remains dangerous. The M6 is safer than the Great North Road ever was, but it's not safe. And as long as people die on roads, other people will tell stories about those deaths, will report experiencing something at death sites, will struggle to explain why certain locations feel wrong. The supernatural framework is one attempt at explanation. Psychology offers another. Perhaps both are partially true. Perhaps neither captures the full complexity. We conclude now, having travelled 6 of Britain's deadliest roads, having examined centuries of documented death and centuries of reported hauntings. What have we learned about the relationship between tragedy and legend, between documented history and reported experience, between the certainty of death and the uncertainty of what follows? We return now from Britain's deadliest roads, from 7 centuries of documented death on the Great North Road, from Hounslow Heath, where executed highwaymen were displayed in gibbets for years, from the A6, where legend and reality become indistinguishable, from the A616 Stocksbridge bypass, where construction workers disturbed medieval plague burials, from Bluebell Hill, where a bride-to-be died the night before her wedding, from the M6, where modern engineering intersects with ancient patterns of death. What have we learned? We've learned that the deaths are not disputed. Court records, burial registers, newspaper archives, coroner's reports, all document thousands of people who died on these roads over centuries. The Great North Road's coaching accidents killed hundreds. Hounslow Heath's highwaymen murdered dozens before being executed themselves. The A6's documented robberies and murders span centuries. Stocksbridge's plague victims died by the hundreds during the Black Death. Bluebell Hill's dangerous geometry has killed continuously from coaching era to modern day. The M6's fatal crashes continue despite modern safety engineering. These deaths are real. The archives preserve names, dates, circumstances. The suffering is documented. The fear is documented. This is not legend. This is preserved historical fact. We've also learned that the reports of unexplained phenomena are real. Not real in the sense of supernatural entities existing, but real in the sense that people genuinely experience something and report it. Police officers filing incident reports, construction workers quitting jobs, drivers contacting emergency services believing they've hit pedestrians. These reports are documented, consistent, clustering at specific locations where historical deaths occurred. The gap between documented deaths and documented reports is where certainty ends. We know people died. We know others report experiencing something at death sites. What we don't know, what perhaps we cannot know, is the nature of the connection between historical death and contemporary experience. Victorian society explained this connection through spiritualism. They believed the dead could linger, that violent death created ghosts, that certain locations retained imprints of tragedy. This framework made sense to them. It explained reported experiences using concepts available in their cultural context. Modern psychology offers different explanations: highway hypnosis, pareidolia, expectation-driven perception, hypervigilance, trauma response. These frameworks explain reported experiences using what we know about human perception and cognition. They don't require supernatural belief. They're testable, rational, consistent with scientific understanding. But do these frameworks explain all experiences? Do they explain why reports cluster at specific documented death sites rather than scattering randomly? Do they explain consistency of descriptions across centuries? Do they explain cases where multiple witnesses report the same phenomenon simultaneously? Perhaps psychology explains most cases, but not all. Perhaps some residue exists. Call it memory, call it imprint, Call it whatever framework allows you to hold the tension between skepticism and reported experience. Perhaps roads do remember, not consciously, but through some mechanism where human consciousness encounters echoes of violent death. Or perhaps the skeptics are entirely correct. Perhaps every report has a rational psychological explanation. Perhaps nothing supernatural exists, only complex interactions between memory, expectation, perception, and anxiety. Perhaps human psychology, combined with historical knowledge, creates all phantom coaches, all hitchhiker ghosts, all feelings of dread at specific locations. The evidence permits both interpretations. The deaths are documented beyond dispute. The reports of unexplained phenomena are documented beyond dispute. The gap between is where belief and skepticism meet, where evidence reaches its limits, where individual experience becomes the final arbiter. What we can say with certainty: thousands died on Britain's roads over centuries. Their deaths created fear, trauma, grief. Victorian society processed that fear through ghost stories. Modern society processes it through psychological frameworks. But the underlying pattern remains constant. Where people die violently, other people report experiencing something at those locations. Whether these experiences are genuine hauntings, whether they're psychological responses to knowledge about locations' dark histories, whether there's something else entirely, the pattern itself is real. Sites of violent death acquire reputations. People approach those sites with heightened alertness. Ambiguous stimuli are interpreted as confirming expectations. Ghost stories circulate, reinforce expectations, shape perceptions. Perhaps the most honest answer is that we don't know. We don't know if consciousness survives death. We don't know if violent death affects location in ways that persist. We don't know if roads remember. We know the deaths occurred. We know the reports continue. The gap between is where mystery lives. And perhaps mystery is acceptable. Perhaps not everything requires explanation. Perhaps some experiences should remain in the territory of the uncertain, the ambiguous, the personally interpreted. Perhaps ghost stories serve important functions: memorial, warning, meaning-making, regardless of whether ghosts exist supernaturally. The Great North Road remembers 7 centuries of death, whether through human memory or through something else. Hounslow Heath remembers its gibbeted dead. The A6 remembers Dick Turpin and all who died there. Stocksbridge remembers its plague victims. Bluebell Hill remembers Suzanne Brown. The M6 remembers its modern dead. The remembering is real. The form that remembering takes, whether psychological, whether supernatural, whether something else, remains uncertain. I am Mr. Ravenhurst, and I will return with another exploration of how tragedy becomes legend, how documented history intersects with reported experience, how the dead are remembered by the living. Until then, when you travel Britain's roads, remember they have histories. Thousands died on routes you drive casually. Their deaths are documented. Whether they persist, whether roads remember, whether you might glimpse something at sites where violent death occurred, that you must decide for yourself. Drive carefully. Honor the documented dead by arriving safely. And understand that the most haunting thing about Britain's roads is not the ghost stories but the documented reality. People died preventably. Societies allowed these deaths to continue for centuries, and we've only recently begun to take traffic deaths seriously enough to systematically reduce it. The roads remember. Whether through human consciousness or through something else, whether as history or as haunting, Britain's deadliest roads remember their victims. What form that memory takes, what you might experience at sites of historical tragedy, whether the dead truly linger, that remains in the territory of the uncertain. But the deaths were certain, the suffering was certain, the fear was certain, and the stories, whether we interpret them as history or as haunting, keep that certainty alive across centuries. The dead are not forgotten. Their stories persist. And every driver who exercises caution on a dangerous curve, who remembers that roads were once deadly, who honors the past by traveling safely into the future, they continue the work of memory that ghost stories began. Britain's deadliest roads are safer now than ever before, but they are not safe. Death continues, and as long as death continues, stories will continue. Whether those stories are ghosts or warnings or memories or something else, they serve the same purpose. They remember the dead, they warn the living, they acknowledge that the boundary between life and death, between past and present, between history and haunting, is thinner than we think. The roads are beneath us still. Drive them knowing their histories. Experience them however you experience them. And remember, the ghosts, whether real or psychological, whether memory or something more, arise from documented tragedy. The supernatural stories began with real deaths. The legends preserve real names. And the fear, whether of ghosts or of accidents, serves the same function. It keeps us alert, keeps us cautious, keeps us remembering that travel, however routine it seems, carries the weight of all those who traveled before and never arrived.